We are ready to roll. Thank you for joining us at Actualize. This is the first of a webinar series which will include many screencasts, many live webinars to come. My name is Jay Wengro. I am the founder and CEO of Actualize. And today I'm going to be telling you more about the intro to web development, specifically using the three languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And one of the things that we're going to delve into is why exactly do we need three languages to build websites? So we're going to see exactly why in just a moment. I'm going to share my screen with you. So right now you should see my Chrome browser, and you'll also see me in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Since I'll probably be blocking some of the code on your screen, you might want to drag me to the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Now, if at any time you have questions, you'll be able to enter them into the Zoom platform through the chat feature that we have there. And Chris Bateson, who I have in the studio with me, will be compiling the questions as I go. And then during various intervals during the webinar, I'll stop and ask him if there are any questions from the audience, and I will do my best to address them. So let's get started. If you would like to follow along, I have a website up here called codepen.io. Now this webcast will be recorded, so don't be concerned about taking notes or forgetting things. This is all going to be on our YouTube channel and on our website at www.actualize.co. So let's talk about making a web page. The way CodePen works is that we have three boxes where we can enter various types of code. There's a type of programming language called HTML, there is one called CSS, and there is one called JavaScript. So the JS here stands for JavaScript. We are going to enter code in each of these three boxes throughout this webinar. I'm going to enter HTML code in this leftmost box, CSS code in the middle box, and JavaScript code in the right-hand box. Let us first begin with HTML. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, but the good news is that no one actually calls it that. They just call it HTML. So you can just call it HTML. If you actually called it Hypertext Markup Language, people would have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So to build a web page, the raw structure of it lives in the HTML code. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to write one line of HTML, and then I'll explain it. Now, in CodePen, while the code is written on the upper half of the screen, the resulting web page can be seen on the bottom half of the screen. So you can actually take this window and make it larger or smaller. And this represents the actual web page. So this line of HTML code that we've written has produced this headline in the web page. Now, what exactly is going on here in this HTML code? So every piece of HTML that we write is called an element, an HTML element. This is an H1 HTML element. Now, what is an H1? An H1 represents the headline, as if it's a newspaper, the number one headline of the web page. Now, just to make this a little more real, here is an article about Bitcoin. Now, we're not going to really discuss Bitcoin at all, but the point is that when you look at this article, you will notice that there are various components to the page. Here, this Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, that essentially is the headline of this page. We also have some author information here. We have an abstract. We have a subheader over here with the introduction. And then we have the actual primary content, the actual paragraphs of content. Similarly, when it comes to HTML, we use HTML to describe the various aspects of the page as well. So this headline, this H1 element, is the equivalent of this kind of headline, in this particular article. Now, we can create other kinds of HTML elements as well. If you wanted to create something like a subheadline, then you can use the H2 HTML element. So H2, this is the subheader. Now, if you notice carefully, each HTML element that I've been using so far, the H1 and the H2, work as follows. They each begin and end with what are called HTML tags. Those are these angle brackets that you see, the less than and greater than sign. This is the HTML tag. So each HTML element that we have here is surrounded by two HTML tags. So the fact that we have this is the headline in between the H1 opening tag and the H1 closing tag is what indicates to the browser that everything in between those two tags will represent the H1. That will represent the headline. And similarly for the H2. Since the content, this is the subheader, falls between the H2 opening tag and the H2 closing tag, then that indicates that this content, this is the subheader, is an H2, it is a subheader. Now, Chris, do you have any questions so far from the audience?
No.
Okay, sweet. So if you look carefully, you'll notice that when it comes to the closing tags, I have put a / right before the characters H1 and right before the characters H2. And that is a difference that we must put between the opening tag and a closing tag. That is just part of the way the HTML language is structured. Opening tags do not have that / within it, and the closing tags do. So this is pretty simple. You can actually create header tags all the way down to H6. So HTML comes with H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Treat those as like subheaders, sub-subheaders, sub-subheaders, and so on. To create regular content, we use the P element, which P stands for paragraph. So we can say this is a paragraph. And I did not spell that right. So once again, we have a P opening tag, and we have a P closing tag with that /. The content within makes it that the browser treats it as a paragraph. Now, HTML is all about these semantics. That is, it describes what are the different things on the page. This is the headline, this is the subheadline, this is the main content. So this is all pretty straightforward. The truth is that HTML is a very easy language. There aren't even that many different types of elements out there. And honestly, H1s, H2, and Ps are by far the most common. There's a few others that you can use to make images, links, and videos. But HTML is a pretty straightforward language. And do we have a question?
No, but I have a question.
Yes, Chris.
These HTML tags, what happens if you forget to put the closing one?
If you forget to put a closing tag, so that's a great question, Chris's question. What happens if you forget a closing tag on an HTML element? So it depends. Browsers might act differently. Let's see what happens if we actually eliminate the H2. So as you can see, some weird things happen. It seems to make this line, this is a paragraph, be as big and as bold as this is the subheader. It's not treating it correctly. It's almost treating, or it is treating both of these lines as if they are H2s. So the closing tags are pretty crucial. If you're missing one, your page can go a little haywire at times. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so now, before we move on to CSS, let's talk about what we're going to actually build today. We're going to make a little game. It's going to be a Star Wars game. And admittedly, it's not going to be the most fun game in the world, but it is a game. It's a game where we have Luke facing off with Darth Vader. And Luke has to use the Force to kill Darth Vader. And that's the game that we're going to be creating. And we're going to be creating this as a web page using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's create this game. We'll start with a simple H1. The name of this game is going to be Use the Force. Luke, maybe I should use capital. Okay, the name of the game is Use the Force, Luke. So here, the H1 is used as the primary introducing line of our web page. It's not a headline in the way that our Bitcoin article headline was, or a headline from a newspaper, but it is the main thing that calls attention to what is going on this web page. So the name of our game is Use the Force, Luke. Now let's already start jumping into CSS. While HTML is the language of the web that describes what the different elements on your page are, CSS is the language that describes how these elements should actually appear on your web page. So HTML, although you're saying this is the headline, this is the paragraph, does not dictate what they look like. Is your paragraph red, black? How big is it? What font is it? That stuff, all the visuals, is the domain of CSS. And now you'll begin to see why we need at least two languages. HTML is about describing the elements on the page, and CSS is about describing how those elements should actually appear. So here's how you write some CSS. I'll just do one example. I'm going to break it down. So as you see, I've made this headline, Use the Force, Luke. I've turned it red. And the way I've done that is with this CSS right here. And the way you understand the CSS is for all H1s, we're applying the following rule. We're applying the rule that the color of H1s on our web page should be red. So there is an interesting syntax here. We start with the name of the particular HTML element. Then we have this curly brace. We have an ending curly brace at the end. And in between, we apply what's called a CSS rule. It is a rule that says for all, in this example anyway, for all H1s, we want the color to be red. Now we can alter this in other ways as well. We can say that the font size should be 72 px, which stands for pixels. And now our headline is much, much bigger. Perhaps it's a little too big. You can easily play around with the different settings to see what you want it to be. So let's make it 36 pixels. Okay, that looks good. So now we have this beautiful web page where we have Use the Force, Luke. We made it so that the color of that font is red. We've also made it that the font size is 36 pixels. Now, CSS comes with many, many different types of attributes. We mentioned that HTML is a simple language. It comes with only a few different types of elements. But CSS, on the other hand, comes with hundreds of different types of rules that you can apply to the visual aspects of all these HTML elements. Chris, do you have any questions?
No, there are no questions.
Okay, sweet. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to actually make the visual representation of Luke. So here we go. To do this, I'm going to introduce a new kind of HTML element, and this is called a div. Now, the div is sort of like this amorphous HTML element, as opposed to a p tag, which represents a paragraph, or a h1, which represents a headline, or h2. Div is sort of like, you can use a div to be anything. The div is sort of like the catch-all. If you don't have like a great HTML element to describe something, a div might be a good choice. So in this example, we're creating a visual representation of a fictional character. HTML does not come with a Luke Skywalker HTML elements. But at the same time, I wouldn't classify Luke as a paragraph or as a headline or as an image. So instead, we're going to use a div, which basically, again, is this catch-all. We can use it for anything. Now, I'm going to put the word Luke in there. And as you can see, if you look carefully enough, you can see Luke, the word Luke appears on our web page. Now, admittedly, that is not the best visual representation of Luke, so we're going to use a little bit of CSS to make Luke just a little bit more like Luke. So since this CSS is going to be applied to our div, we need to make a new CSS rule that applies to divs. So we made a div, and now we're going to make it, we're going to start by giving a border around Luke. And you'll see this take shape, or not, as we go through it. So border style solid basically says to make a solid border around Luke. When I say solid, that's opposed to like dashed, which makes a like dotted kind of border. We don't want a dotted kind of border, we want a solid border. Now, we're also, to make Luke a little better, we're going to put the word Luke in the center of that rectangle. So there's another convenient CSS rule called text-align, and we're going to set Luke's text-align to be centered. So now we have it so that the word Luke appears in the center of that box. Now this box is way too long to look like Luke, so we're going to make it a little narrower. So we're going to set the width of this div. We're going to make this div 100 pixels. So now you can see Luke just got a lot narrower. We're also going to give Luke a height of 100 pixels. So now Luke is this perfect square. Now it would look a lot nicer if Luke, the word Luke, wasn't appearing at the very top of that box. It would be nice for him to be a little more centered. So to achieve that, we can use another CSS rule called line height. Now line height basically puts certain padding above and below the actual words. So it basically forces, this particular CSS rule is a little more difficult to understand, but treat it as it adds space above and below Luke. So since we're adding, we're basically saying that there should be 100 pixels of space from top to bottom surrounding Luke, it makes it so that the word Luke appears in the center of this box. So it's fair to say that this looks a lot like Luke, right? Pretty much the same exact thing. So now that we've created Luke successfully, now it's time to create Darth Vader. Cue the music. Or not. Okay, that was the worst idea ever. I thought I might teach the rest of the lesson as Darth Vader, but that was a really bad idea. I couldn't see a blasted thing. Let's actually go ahead and make Darth Vader with HTML and CSS. So I'm going to make a new div called Darth Vader. And as you can see, that creates a new box immediately below Luke. Now the reason that Darth Vader became a box as well is because Darth Vader is also a div, just like Luke. And these CSS rules that we applied to the div apply to all divs on the page. So it applies both to Luke and to Darth Vader since they are both divs. Now, to make Darth Vader look a little more like Darth Vader, we're going to have to, I would like to turn him black. Maybe we'll give him a black background and white letters. So, Chris.
We
have a question
from Jasmine. It says, what is the purpose of the semicolon at the end of each line in CSS?
Oh, thank you. So Jasmine had a great question. Why is there a semicolon at the end of each line in CSS? And the answer is simply that that is the arbitrary rule of how you write CSS. The creators of CSS could have made it that you don't need semicolons at the end, but you are supposed to add semicolons. Technically, you can add, by the fact that there are semicolons, it allows you to put all your CSS on one line, and that can have advantages in certain situations. But just for now, take it as a rule that all lines of CSS end in a semicolon. Is that cool? Okay.
Yeah, we have one more.
Another question? Yeah.
I'm not sure if I completely grasp it, but how do we do CSS with div and a particular name in our code? For instance, a Rails app.
So, okay, so Rails, yeah, Rails is perhaps a topic that we'll cover in a future webinar. Now, it's a little bit out of the scope of the conversation for tonight, but that is a great question. You know, the languages of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript alone are for making these raw web pages. Something like Rails is a way to make it that you can actually deploy, basically put these web pages on the web and allow them to act a lot more functional. And again, that will become clear as we cover these things when we get to those webinars. That's a great question. Okay, now let's go ahead and make Darth Vader black. So my first instinct is to add some rules to this div in the CSS. Now you might see where this might go wrong, but I'm going to make, here's another CSS rule called background color. I'm going to make the background black. Now the problem, as you immediately see, is that any rule that I put for a div is going to apply to all divs on the page. And therefore, while I made Darth Vader black, I also inadvertently turned Luke black as well. But I want to keep Luke white. So now the question is, how do we affect one div versus another div so that one div has certain aspects, but other divs can have other visual aspects? So there are multiple ways to get around this. One classic way of dealing with this situation is by adding what's called an ID to a particular HTML element. And let me show you what I mean. If we go inside the opening tag of this Darth Vader div, we can add an ID, and this is how we do it. You basically say ID equals quotation marks, and you can put anything you want, pretty much, in between those quotation marks. In this case, I put Darth because he's Darth. Now this concept of putting this extra information inside an HTML tag, these are called HTML attributes. There are different types of HTML attributes. We're actually going to encounter another one later in the webinar. But this ID is a special kind of HTML attribute. Now that we've added this ID to this particular div, we can make CSS rules that apply exclusively to this div with that ID. And let me show you how. In our CSS, I'm going to make a new rule that applies to the # Darth. What this means is that all the CSS rules that appear here between those two curly braces, these rules will apply only to an HTML element that has the ID of Darth. So I'm going to take this background color black, move it out of the rules for regular divs, and I'm going to add it to the Darth ID. And now as you can see, the Luke div remains with a white background, whereas the Darth Vader div now has a background color of black. Now, another interesting, important thing to note is that how does the browser know that Darth Vader should still be a square and that it should have, well, it's hard to see the border here, but why should it be a square that it's 100 pixels wide, 100 pixels high? How does it know that? All we've said about Darth is that Darth has a background color of black. So the answer is that the way CSS works is that since these rules of div apply to Darth because Darth is a div, and we also have these rules, or this one rule that applies to the ID of Darth, CSS combines the rules. It takes all of them and applies them to Darth Vader. So since Darth Vader is a div, all these rules regarding a div is applied. So therefore, Darth Vader has a width and height of 100 pixels. His, well, again, that's the only thing you can really see here. But it also applies this rule that since he also has this ID of Darth, on top of the div rules, we add this special additional rule that Darth, whoever has the Darth ID, will also additionally have a background color of black. Once we can do this, we can also change the actual words to white, and that we do with color. So the way CSS was created, it's not called background color and foreground color, it's background color and color. Color itself represents the color of the font. So now we've got Luke and Darth Vader as represented by these beautiful CSS boxes. Chris, do you have any questions?
Let's see. No, no one has asked a question.
Okay, well, feel free to ask questions in the chat whenever you have them. Now, to make this a little bit easier, a little easier to see, I would like to put Darth Vader next to Luke instead of putting him under Luke. So to do that, I'm going to add a rule to the divs. And this, honestly, is a more difficult rule to understand, but it's called float. And we'll say float left. And when we say float left, we basically, what that does is instead of making sure that each div is on its own new line in the browser, instead it floats everything, it shoves them so that everything is to the left of the next div. That's basically a simplistic way of explaining it. But now, by doing that, we've achieved that Luke and Darth Vader are next to one another. Chris, do you have seems like we have a question.
Yeah, there was a question asked, but someone answered it in chat.
Well,
One question
yeah.
I have.
Yeah.
Do you have background color in Darth? What would happen if you had background color also in div?
So if we added a background color to the div as well, what kind of background color should we add?
We can do blue.
Okay, so now Chris is asking a really intriguing question, is what if you have contradictory rules? So basically, for Darth, we've said that background color is black, but for divs, we said background color is blue. As you can see, the way the browser, at the end of the day, deals with this is that it does indeed make Luke blue, but Darth stays black. The question is, why did the browser decide that Darth should stay black as opposed to following the rule of blue from general divs? And this is a question, it's a great question. I want to, I'll just answer it simply for now, but it gets into a concept called specificity that basically the rules of CSS, when one rule will trump another rule, one of the key pieces to that is how specific is the rule. A more specific rule will trump a more general rule. And in CSS land, a rule that applies to an ID is considered a more specific rule than a rule that applies to just a general div. And therefore, the rule applied to the ID, if it contradicts the rule of a general div, the specific rule will trump the general rule. And this, yeah, another question.
Yeah, we have one more.
Yeah.
And it says, so the left property, how come the Darth Vader div is on the same line with Luke?
Yeah, so that's exactly what float does. Without the float property, what the browser tries to take every div and put it on a new vertical, or I guess new horizontal section of the browser. Float basically says, ignore those regular rules and shove everything so that they're left of one another. So now with float left, basically makes it that Luke and Darth Vader, Luke is to the left of Darth. Yeah.
What would happen if you had float right?
Great question. Let's try it. So basically shifts all those things to the right hand of the screen. And if you have me at the bottom right of your screen, I might be covering it. But Darth Vader and Luke are now at the right hand of the screen. Float is a tricky rule, but for now we're going to just leave it as simple as that. Cool. Let's make Luke white again. And now we're going to, let's go ahead and put a little space between Luke and Darth Vader. I mean, having Darth right next to Luke is pretty intimidating. As we know, Darth Vader is a pretty intimidating guy. So let's go ahead and add some space between Luke and Darth. So to do that, we're going to add a new CSS rule to divs in general that I'm going to call it margin. Well, that's what it's called. Margin 50 pixels. And what this does, it surrounds each div with this invisible white space, 50 pixels in each direction surrounding it. And so there's 50 pixels around Luke, 50 pixels around Darth, and now they're spaced out a little better. It's a little easier to visualize this. Okay, so now you're probably getting the hang of HTML and CSS. And if someone on the street asks you, why do we need HTML and CSS? Why do you need two separate languages to create web pages? They'll be able to answer them. Well, HTML describes, in an abstract way, it describes what are the concepts on the page. And CSS says, are the rules of how those concepts should actually look in a visual way. That's why we need those two different languages. Now, that brings us to the third language of JavaScript. Why do we need a third language of JavaScript? And that will become clear right now. So the game that we want to play here is that we want to use the force against Luke by clicking on him. That's how you use the force, right? So we click on Darth Vader. That should inflict pain and suffering upon him. Now that's functionality. JavaScript is the language that allows you to actually interact with a page. So while HTML describes the concepts of the page in a semantic way, and CSS describes how things should look, JavaScript allows you to do things with them. You can click on it and something will happen. We want to actually make it that when you click on Darth Vader 5 times, he will die. That's a type of functionality that's like, it's an interaction. I click on him and something happens. That's where JavaScript comes in. So let's go ahead and prepare our HTML to be used with JavaScript. So we're going to see how HTML and JavaScript and CSS eventually, they all tie in with each other. We want to make it that something can happen if we click on Darth Vader. To do that, watch carefully as I add a new HTML attribute to the Darth Vader div. Again, I'm still within the opening div of Darth. And I'm going to add an attribute called onClick equals UseForce parentheses. So again, onClick equals sign. There's no space between the onClick and the equal sign. And there's no space between the equal sign and the following quotation marks. But I have onClick equals, and then you can put whatever you want in here. In this case, I'm creating an action that is called UseForce. That is, I could call it whatever I want, but I'm calling it UseForce because by clicking on Darth, we are going to use the force against him. What this does is it allows us to write JavaScript code that will affect this HTML element. To demonstrate, I'm going to write my first line of JavaScript. I'm going to write this. Function UseForce, and I will explain this shortly. So before I explain this, let's see what happens now when I click on Darth Vader. When I click on Darth Vader, now something happens. This pop-up box, known as an alert box, pops up and says, you use the force against Darth Vader. So our page, with a little bit of JavaScript, has now become interactive. Let's go ahead and break down what this all means. So going back to our HTML, we added this UseForce. Well, we added an onClick attribute. Within the quotes, we said UseForce and then empty parentheses. What that says is that when you click on Darth Vader, that should trigger a JavaScript piece of code called a function. A function is just a fancy way for saying a piece of code. We have this JavaScript function called UseForce. As you can see, we've said the word function here. That tells JavaScript that the following thing is going to be a function. That is, it is going to be a piece of code. We then put these curly braces, and then within the curly braces, we have a line of additional JavaScript code that says alert, parentheses, quotes, use the force against Darth Vader. So basically this alert line, this alert keyword in JavaScript is the keyword, is the JavaScript way of getting that alert pop-up box to appear. So the way this is all connected is that I click on Darth Vader, it triggers this onClick function. This onClick function of UseForce calls this JavaScript function, which is called UseForce, and then triggers the code within it. In this case, the alert box. Now, if you notice, there's a semicolon at the end of this line. And the basic rule for JavaScript, similar to CSS, is this, that every line of JavaScript pretty much ends with a semicolon. And I guess, again, I say pretty much because, as you can see, the lines 1 and 3 don't end with a semicolon. So lines with curly braces generally don't end with a semicolon, but most other lines do. And that's similar to CSS as well, where the lines ending with the curly braces don't actually have a semicolon at the end, but the other lines do. And that's just the rules. That's the sort of arbitrary way that the creators of JavaScript made this JavaScript language. Any questions? Nope? Okay. As a total side note, it's important to explain that there's another programming language out there called Java. And Java is actually a totally different language than JavaScript. It's just by mere fluke that both languages sound very similar. So the Java is another kind of programming language, but JavaScript, which is what we are using tonight, is the language that allows web pages to become functional. Okay, so let's go ahead and make this a little bit fancier. We're going to keep track of how many times we've hit Darth with the force. So to do this, I'm going to make a new section on our web page. I'm going to make an H2. And in there, I'm going to say number of hits, colon. And this is where we're going to track the number of times that we've used the force against Darth Vader. Now, here I'm going to show you something that you haven't seen before. And that's that you can actually, for certain HTML elements, you can have an HTML element within another HTML element. So here I'm going to add something called a span. A span is similar to a div in that it's this amorphous sort of just sort of vague HTML element, but it's perfectly used for this kind of instance. I'm going to put in the number 0. And you'll see in a moment why I put the 0 within a span. But now you can see that our web page displays the number of hits. Now at this point, if I click on Darth Vader, all it does is bring up the alert box, and the number of hits does not currently change. Of course, the reason why the number of hits does not change is because I haven't yet written the JavaScript code to make it change. But that's what we're going to go ahead and do now. So let's add some JavaScript code to our JavaScript section. I'm going to add a little bit of code that appears before this function. And I'm going to create something called a variable. Let me write it first, and then I'll explain it. So here I've said var hits equals 0. This is the JavaScript way of what's called declaring a variable, creating a JavaScript variable. In this case, the JavaScript variable is called hits. Now, in JavaScript or in any programming language, when we discuss variables, we are not discussing algebra. Although variables appear in algebra, they do not mean the same thing as they do in coding languages. So the good news is you don't actually need to know algebra for programming. So what a variable instead is, it's a way of keeping track of something. So at the beginning, when our page first loads, we want to keep track of how many hits have been inflicted against Darth Vader. And when the page loads, by definition, we have not ever clicked on him yet. So by definition, the number of hits against Darth Vader will start out as 0. This is a programming mechanism that will allow us to keep track of the number of hits, because basically we want to make it that every time we hit Darth Vader, we're going to increase the number of hits. We're going to increase the hits variable by 1. And we can just do, excuse me, we can do that right now. I'm going to get rid of this alert box for now. And I'm going to say hits plus plus semicolon. And this is in JavaScript, how to say increase the hits variable by 1. Honestly, plus plus is not intuitive. That's not something that you might guess that's what it means, but that's what it means. Hits plus plus says we're going to increase the amount of hits by 1. Now, when I click on Darth Vader, the variable hits is actually increasing by 1. However, you can't see that because we have not yet connected that to the web page, and we're going to do that right now. We want to say as follows. I'll write it out first and then explain it. So document.getElementByID is a way to refer to a particular HTML element on our page by its ID. To make this work, I need to add an ID to the span because this is the element that we want to grab. So I'm going to say ID equals quotes hits. Going back to the JavaScript code, document.getElementByID hits basically refers to this element in our HTML because that is the HTML element that has an ID of hits. We are then, once we've gotten that element, we can then say special JavaScript code, which is not very intuitive, but .inner HTML equals hits. Let's see what happens now when I click on Darth Vader. So I'm going to click, 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 click. Basically, every time that I click on Darth Vader, the number of hits increases by 1. Let me explain this once again now that you see the complete picture. Every time the page loads, this line of JavaScript runs. We create a variable. Basically, it's a way of tracking things called hits, and it starts out as 0. Then, every time we click on Darth Vader, that triggers the UseForce JavaScript function. Now, within the UseForce JavaScript function, as you can see on the right, every time that function is activated, we increase the number of hits by 1. And then, this is the most complicated line, we find the ID, we find the HTML element on the page that has an ID of hits. In this case, that is this section, as you see here, that surrounds the number. And .inner HTML basically says, let's rewrite the content within that element. And we are now going to make that content be whatever this hits variable is. So if hits, I'm going to refresh the page. Actually, maybe I shouldn't do that. I'm going to start over by just adding a space and backspacing. We've reset it that the number of hits is 0. And right now, since hits is 0, we've indicated that by having the number 0 there. When I click on Darth Vader, click, we've rewritten the inner HTML, that is the inner content of this span that has the ID of hits, and we've made it whatever hits is. So right now hits is 1, so now this element that has an ID of hits is now 1. When hits increases to be 2, when I click again, it becomes 2. Then the number of hits becomes 2 as well. Because every time we use the force, that we trigger this UseForce function, we are essentially rewriting the inner content of this span to reflect whatever the variable is up to. Yes?
Okay, we have 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, where does document.getElementByID come from? And can you explain this again?
Yeah, so document.getElementByID is built into the JavaScript language. So document actually refers to the web page, and GetElementByID is a special JavaScript function built into JavaScript that allows you to refer to any element whose ID is, in this case, hits, or whatever you decide to put in those parentheses and quotation marks. So by calling document.getElementByID hits, that is how our JavaScript can refer to this span right here, because this span is the element on our page that has the ID of hits. Now, right now, the content within that span is the number 0. But as we increase the variable hits, we keep on rewriting that inner content within the span to reflect whatever the variable is up to. So the variable, think of it as like a counter. So hits starts out as 0, but when hits becomes 1, then the span, the content within there becomes 1. When hits becomes 2, like it is right now, then the content within the span becomes 2. Chris, you said there's another question?
Yeah. How does JavaScript understand the difference between the variable you created called hits and the hits within the GetElementByID?
That's a great question, and I was planning on touching that right now, so thank you for asking that. The honest truth is that the hits, that is the name of the variable, and the hits, that is the name of my ID, although they're both called hits, that is purely coincidental, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. So let me just show you what I mean. If I wanted to make the ID called something else, let me call it PurpleHippo. Then I can call this ID PurpleHippo as well. And my code will work just the same. Basically, as I click on Darth Vader, the number of hits still increases. How does that work? Because basically document.getElementByID, PurpleHippo, says find the HTML element on my page that has an ID called PurpleHippo. What is that? That just happens to be the span. Now, I call the hits because to me hits is a much more normal name for that span rather than PurpleHippo. But to demonstrate this point, yes, this ID can be PurpleHippo as long as I refer to it here as well. Similarly, I could have named my variable something else. I can call my variable yellow kangaroo. And as long as I always refer to yellow kangaroo, that should still work. Again, my code becomes a little less intuitive that way. So, but based on your suggestion, I'm actually going to change this. I'm going to make the ID called, I'll keep the ID called hits. But maybe I'll call a variable counter. Maybe that's better. But as you can see, there really is no connection between the variable and the ID name. The fact that I had named them all hits previously was because they're both hits, but the programming, the JavaScript doesn't actually understand that connection. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now, the next thing that we'd like to do is kill Darth Vader. So we're going to make it that we kill Darth Vader when we hit him 5 times. To do this, I'm going to add some more JavaScript to our UseForce function. And we're going to do something called an if statement, which I'll write out and then I'll explain it. So if hits equals 5, which basically, oh shoot, I shouldn't say hits anymore, say counter. If counter is 5, if we've reached 5, then, curly braces, we're gonna make an alert box, because we all love those, that say you've killed Darth Vader. Let's see this in action and then I'll explain it. So we're going to click on Darth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Upon the 5th click, this alert box pops up that says you've killed Darth Vader. So let's explain that. It does read a little bit like English, so it's not crazy unintuitive, but if counter is 5, so counter starts out as 0, as we click on Darth, the counter increases by 1. If we actually get as far as 5, if counter is 5, then trigger this code that comes within the curly braces that triggers the alert box that says you've killed Darth Vader. Now you're probably all wondering, why are there 3 equal signs? Basically, that is a JavaScript way of saying if something is equivalent to something. So if counter equals, the way we'd say it in English, if counter equals 5, so the way to say that in JavaScript is if counter equals, or triple equals 5. That is just the way they made JavaScript. You'll notice that when you make an if statement, you need these parentheses right there, right after the word if. You need these curly braces, and the stuff that should happen if this condition is true will appear within the curly braces. So far, so good? Question? Yeah.
Yeah, I have another one. Is it possible to write counter equals document.getElementByID hits.innerHTML to when declaring the variable?
Oh, so your question is, instead of making counter be 0, can we actually, let me make sure I understand the question correctly. Basically to do this. Is that right?
Yes.
Let's try it out. It is working. Yes. There's a little bit of a lag here with CodePen. Let me demonstrate that again. So we're at 0. When I click on Darth Vader, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a great question. Basically, instead of setting it to be 0, we're actually setting it to be whatever the span currently is, which is 0. So that's a very clever way of going about it. So yes, we can do that. I'm going to turn it back to 0 for simplicity's sake, but that's a fantastic question.
And then the last question.
Yeah.
Why is it when you refresh the page, it goes back to 0?
When I refresh, great question. So yeah, so the question is, why does it always start back at 0 when I refresh the page? The answer is that web pages don't remember anything. They have a terrible memory. So when you reload a page, the browser simply takes your HTML and displays it as it sees it. And since in the original HTML, the number within the span is 0, that's what it shows. The only way that could ever change is if we ever trigger JavaScript in the future that will actually increase that span, that number. But when you start off reloading a page, everything is cleared, all the memory has been forgotten, and it starts over with the raw HTML. And only can JavaScript triggered afterwards modify the existing original HTML. Cool? Okay. Now we've successfully killed Darth Vader, so that's pretty cool. We can now go ahead and add one last finishing touch, which is it would be really cool to make Darth Vader turn red after we kill him. So maybe instead of the alert box, we're going to instead make Darth Vader red to indicate that he is dead. To do this, we're going to do the following. Document.getElementByID Darth. So similar to this document.getElementByID that we had previously, once again, we're getting another HTML element by its ID. In this case, we're getting the Darth element, which is this Darth div, right? Because this Darth div is the one that has the ID of Darth. And we're going to change its CSS. So you can actually change the CSS of an HTML element through JavaScript. How confusing is that? So if you say .style, you can choose a particular CSS attribute. In this case, I want to make the background color different. I'm going to change the background to red. Now this, again, will only happen once we click on Darth Vader 5 times. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to click, waiting for CodePen to catch up. 2, 3, 4, 5. Boom. Darth Vader is red. So we managed to manipulate and modify the CSS rules through JavaScript. Again, let's review this line. Document.getElementByID Darth says, let's find the HTML element on the page that has the ID of Darth, and that would be our Darth Vader box. Then .style says we're going to modify a particular CSS rule of that HTML element, the one with the ID Darth. And we're going to change this particular thing, background color, to red. Notice the quotes. That is just part of the way you write JavaScript. But we've successfully killed Darth Vader using just a mere bit of coding. And Chris, you said there's a question?
Yeah. Will that CSS change to the background be there forever?
So this is a great question. Going back to what we said before, every time we reload the page, everything resorts back to the original HTML and CSS. So to trigger that, I'm just going to add a space into my JavaScript. Basically, the way CodePen works is every time you make any change in your code, it resets. The same would happen if you refresh your page. JavaScript is all forgotten. I mean, the code is still there, but anything you've done with it has been forgotten. So the web page simply displays the original HTML again and the original CSS again. And in order to modify anything in the future, you have to, again, re-trigger the JavaScript by clicking on stuff. Is that cool?
And then we have another question.
Yeah.
Saying, why do you use the square brackets for when declaring background color? Yeah, so basically that's basically the way they made JavaScript. This is the way the style keyword works. It is meant to be followed with square brackets and quotes. There's actually another way to do it as well, but it doesn't work in all circumstances. So I'm basically showing you the way that works all the time. And that is with these square brackets. And yeah, I agree it's pretty ugly, but that's just the way they made JavaScript. They say that JavaScript was created by someone in 11 days to meet a particular deadline. So you can't blame it for being ugly. Other questions? No.
Okay. That's that. Let me save this. Maybe I'll give this the title of Use the Force, Luke. And this way, if you see this URL up on top, you can write that down. And if you want to play around with our example, so codepen.io/actualize/pen, those letters, V, capital R, capital G, capital R, lowercase x, capital K.
You can copy and put it into chat.
And I can copy it, so maybe Chris, can you copy and put it into chat? Awesome. Oh, no? I could. I'll put it in chat in a moment. Let's do that right now. Or actually, are you able to do it, Chris?
Sure, I can handle it.
Okay, thank you. Any last questions? Because that's basically it for now. Cool. So just wanted to thank our producers, Josh Nixon, Chris Bateson. If you want to learn more about Actualize, if you like this kind of stuff, if you think that this might be a potential career for you, we do this. This is what we do. We're all educator developers, so that we're educators first, developers second. Each one of our instructors is a professional educator in addition to a professional developer. And we use our unique instructional style to teach people how to code and make that their career. Our bootcamp is 12 weeks long. Our actual upcoming cohort date is April 8th. We actually have, in addition to in-person bootcamp in Chicago, we have an online live bootcamp that can be taken by anyone in the US. It's all through live courses using the Zoom platform like this, except that it's much better because not just do you have your live instructor, but you can also see and interact with all the other people in your class at that time. If you want to learn more, check out actualize.co. And thank you all for joining tonight. Hope to see you in the next webinar. Have a good one.